Okay. So maybe I sit here at the end. Yeah, you sit. So should we invite the speakers to come and sit? Come and sit.
Two speakers that they have to share the mics.
Okay. Please come and sit. Anywhere. As long as we balance out the
Is there any order or?
Is there an order? Bruce, let me look. It doesn't matter, you should sit anywhere. I'll call you from anywhere, yes. Sit anywhere. I know I'm starting with Bruce, but it doesn't matter. Wherever Bruce is, you can speak. We'll have to share the mics apparently. Was it just us two? Wasn't there one more?
Oh, we can share this one.
Hello, good, how are you? Hi guys. Bruce is coming from level 7. I don't know if you see messages. Slightly delayed. So should we wait or? Should we wait for Bruce or fast? Okay. We still have 3 minutes. You're right, we still have 3 minutes.
Yeah.
We have 3 mics. So you want to share?
Yeah.
Yeah. So who's keeping me honest on time? Who's keeping me honest on time? You will? Let me know you keep, because I have 5 to 7 minutes at the beginning, right? With the weather. Just here.
She needs water.
But it's the weather. Welcome everyone. We will be starting shortly. We're waiting for one more speaker. Thank you. Welcome everyone. We'll be starting shortly. All right, our speaker is here. We're going to be starting shortly. Bruce, have a seat.
They haven't quite finished on 7. I left slightly early. They haven't quite finished now. Thank you. So yeah, they went probably 15 minutes over. So. Anybody know any futurist jokes? Any jokes about futurists? No?
They tried to play very interesting instruments.
Sorry?
They tried to play very interesting instruments.
Fair enough. That's just true though, right?
Good morning. We are starting. We're starting now. Welcome everybody to this food panel. I'm trying to remember the name of it. We have a very exciting agenda today, really talking about cutting-edge innovation around food. So I'll give a few open remarks, and then I'll invite my expert panelists here to talk to us about this excellent innovation. We're talking about food, and we know that in 2070, the world is projected to reach a total population of at least 10 billion or over. And that population will need to be fed. As we sit today, we have already exhausted most of our planetary boundaries. You know, global food production is a major driver of biodiversity loss, nature loss, primarily due to land conversion and degradation. It consumes over 70% of fresh water globally, and produces a quarter of anthropogenic global greenhouse gas emissions. Of course, the food system is also impacted by climate change, and that discussion will be very hot at COP28 when it starts soon, and vulnerable very much to higher temperatures as well as unpredictable weather events. And we know as the population grows, the demand for meat grows, and by 2050 it's expected to double. And frankly, the science is very clear. Even if we were to stop fossil fuel emissions immediately, the food system itself, especially animal agriculture, would push the planet past 1.5 degrees. So we must do something about food systems. And then when you look at the various health aspects that are related to that, you're talking about antibiotic resistance, because 70% of all antibiotics are actually given to animals. And then you look at the likely causes of the next pandemic, it's also going to be meat consumption. So frankly, we need innovation. For us to be able by 2070 to feed the world, we need innovation. And that's why we have this session here, because we have a fantastic panelist here who are going to talk about alternative proteins. Now, alternative proteins are important because they do not require antibiotics, so they deal with the antibiotic issue. They also protect our fragile ecosystems, like I said, that are really being plummeted by the current food system, and reduce greenhouse gas emissions, of course. And a transition would also unlock hundreds of millions of square miles for carbon sequestration. So our panelists today are all experts from that domain of alternative proteins and technology, coming from 3 different continents, and they're in a great position to help us to imagine how we can rethink our food system in alternative proteins by 2071. So I will start with you, Bruce, and maybe when you get to talk, you can say a little bit something about yourself. But I want to ask you about how do we get ready to nourish the billions, the 10 billion that I talked about by 2071?
Thank you.
The mic, please use the mic.
Thank you very much, and thanks, folks, for turning up, even though none of you had a good futurist joke. So my name is Bruce Friedrich, president and founder of the Good Food Institute. GFI is a network of nonprofit organizations. So we have GFI in India, Israel, Brazil, Asia Pacific, based out of Singapore, and Europe. We operate at the EC level as well as in the UK and Germany so far. We have about 215 full-time staff. The plurality of our team members are scientists. And the fundamental question that we're trying to solve is, what does it look like to produce meat from plants that, from the perspective of the consumer, is indistinguishable? And what does it look like to produce actual animal meat using cell cultivation instead of live animals? So just like you can take a seed or a cutting from a plant and bathe the seed or the cutting in nutrients and it will grow into a whole plant, you can do the same thing with a small sampling of cells from a chicken or a pig or a fish or any other animal, and it will grow into actual animal meat. And these technologies are, to the meat industry's massive contribution to emissions, as well as the meat industry's use of medically relevant antibiotics, as well as the meat industry's use to contribution to land loss. These are, to agriculture, what electric vehicles are to gas-powered cars, and what renewable energy is to fossil fuels. And it actually is a much bigger part of the solution than electric vehicles. If the entire world went to EVs, that would decrease somewhere on the order of 2.5 gigatons of CO2 equivalent on an annual basis. This gets us up to north of 10 gigatons, plus massive sequestration opportunities if we move in this direction. And we've only just gotten started. Many people in this room are probably thinking, well, I've had a veggie burger and it sucked. And that's a little bit like saying I've driven an electric car 10 years ago and the battery range sucked and there was no charging infrastructure. What futurism recognizes is that things get better. And we've really just started on the endeavor of figuring out how to make meat from plants and cultivate meat from cells. You talked about all the harms it solves for, so I won't repeat that, but that's what GFI is working on, and open sourcing the science to help build an entire ecosystem.
Thank you, Bruce. Maybe before I let you go, I'll ask you one more question. Of course, when you talk about alternative protein and all those new technologies, I come from Africa, and it's a continent that we haven't yet started thinking about these. We may have it in a small scale, but I think that in general, we're still dealing with issues like protein deficiency. We're still trying to get to that level. How do you see us then leapfrogging into this alternative protein space?
Well, there are two ways that we think about alternative proteins and Africa and sort of the global south writ large. Way number one is people in developing economies need more animal protein. People in developed economies need less animal protein for the chronic disease issues that you just mentioned. So right now, the world uses 3 billion hectares of land for animal agriculture. 3 out of 4 billion hectares of land used for agriculture are either grazing animals or growing crops to feed them to animals so that we can eat those animals. It takes 9 calories of crops into a chicken to get 1 calorie back out in the form of chicken meat. It takes 40 calories into a cow to get 1 calorie back out in the form of beef. So you're literally talking about a physiology of the animal. Our best case scenario is 800% food waste. So 8 of the 9 calories grown are fed to farm animals. We're now, 10 years ago, we were feeding 780 million metric tons of crops, corn and wheat, to farm animals. Now it's north of 1.25 billion metric tons of crops, where our best case scenario is that 800% of the calories are wasted. If we go from 3 billion hectares of land to 6 billion hectares of land by 2050 because we double meat consumption, that is what is throwing pastoralists off their land. That is what is throwing smallholders off their land. Commercial fishing is what is decimating aquatic ecosystems so that subsistence fishers have no animals to fish. So this frees up land so that subsistence farmers, pastoralists, smallholders will actually be able to raise meat and eat meat. And it also will decrease pressure on aquatic ecosystems, which will be good for fishing communities. So there's sort of the tautological, the people who have done the least to contribute to climate change are the most adversely impacted by it. This is sort of a longer conversation, but I think we have an extraordinarily strong case that if alternative proteins don't succeed, Paris goals are impossible, which also makes things really, really hard from an adaptation standpoint in the global south.
Okay, well, thank you very much. That was really good. I will now move over to Ahmed from the UAE, and I would like to ask you a little bit from what the other UAE and Dubai views when it comes to food tech.
So I'm very glad to be with you guys today, and my name is Ahmed Alshaibani, actually heading the Food Tech Valley project. From a UAE perspective, basically what we have done is that we looked at the National Food Security Strategy, which was actually launched back in 2018, before the pandemic. Where we actually identified several food items that we need to focus on and to make sure that we deliver for our future. So within these food items, we focus on grains, we focus on vegetable, fruits, as well as alternative proteins. And by doing so, what we are doing right now, we are creating a system, a specialized economic zone to enable these new technologies to establish within the UAE. So we try to forecast and scan different technologies worldwide, what is emerging, and how we can become an early adopter for these type of technologies. And based on the food basket or the target basket, we focus on the technology that we believe that can become a future-proof in a way. However, what we realized in the past year and a half, 2 years, that many of these technologies are still emerging in terms of commercial viabilities. And what we are doing is we are trying to be as much as we can agile for this technology when it comes. So we are adopting the technology that is now commercially viable, but also prepare ourselves to be more agile for the future technologies.
Okay, no, thank you very much. That is very interesting. Maybe just one follow-up would be, what are the challenges that you see? You talked a little bit about how the technologies themselves are not yet ready. What are the challenges and opportunities that you see in your city or in your region, in your entire region?
So it depends on different type of food items mainly, or food technologies. When we are talking about controlled environment agriculture, we see that there is a lot of challenges with the energy cost, of course. But when it comes to alternative protein and protein that is actually developed by fermentation or cellular agriculture or lab-grown meat, in another word, is actually the acceptance of the consumer can become an issue. The cost of actually producing a pound of the meat is actually can become a challenge. When I would say maybe 2013, when they started with producing the first piece of meat, which cost around $300,000 to $330,000, which is a very high amount. However, this price is actually dropping drastically. So first, the cost of producing the meat, the availability of actually different, I would say, system or media to grow. Like, for example, many of the challenges that many startups have is allocating a bioreactor for their actually studies and actually development.
Yeah.
And this is what we found out. In addition to that, you're going to see that even the bioreactor is actually available, is actually used in another industry, which is more high margin, which is pharmaceutical. So identifying these type of challenges is very essential. And at the same time, to be ready for new companies that comes and set up.
Thank you. Thank you, Noah. Thank you. No, it's very clear. You talked about cost and, of course, consumer acceptance. I think even Bruce mentioned that maybe the veggie burger doesn't taste as good as a meat burger. So we have some work to do on cost. David, I think Ahmed mentioned fermentation, and it leads us right to you. You are setting up a precision fermentation plant here in the UAE. Why do you think this is the technology of the future? And what is it exactly?
Sure. It's a pleasure meeting everyone, and thank you for listening today. My name is David Bucca, and I'm the founder and CEO of a food tech startup called Change Food. So we're leveraging what's called precision fermentation technology, which allows us to create effectively bioidentical or nature-identical dairy caseins, or proteins in this case, which we can then use to formulate basically identical cheese and other dairy products. And there's a lot of different subcategories, I guess, within the alternative protein landscape. So this is all under the umbrella of fermentation, but the reason it's called precision fermentation is because we're precisely looking for one particular compound. A good analogy is to think about, raising a cow. It takes 2 to 3 years. You have to feed it a lot of, inputs. It's burping, it's doing its thing, and it's emitting a lot of, pollution. And really what you're looking for at the end of the day, it's consuming grass or a source of carbon, and it's producing, in this case, if you're looking at cheese, you're looking for one particular protein called casein. The rest of the animal is effectively, in some ways, in a very draconian sense, an industrial processor converting sugars into casein, and the rest is byproduct. And so what we're doing is, rather than using a macro organism to do that conversion process, we're using cells. So think about yeast that you use to brew beer. We can program that yeast with the gene from a cow, which effectively enables those yeasts to become miniature dairy-producing microorganisms. Then you can ferment them in very controlled conditions to produce that exact identical ingredient. So it's not a substitute to dairy, it's actually a replacement for dairy. And that's the really powerful, disruptive potential of this technology. And by which you can, reduce greenhouse gas emissions for dairy production by 97%, land use by 99%, water usage by 96%, and energy use by 60%. So it is really a revolutionary step change in the way that we can produce dairy. Part of the challenge, has been alluded to by Ahmed, and is really about scalability of these proteins and how do we produce them at a commercially viable price point. And when you think about dairy, it's a commodity product. So in order to do that, it's a combination of several factors. One is obviously your research and development. How much protein can you express and produce via fermentation? But you must couple that with reducing your operating cost. And that is where scale comes into play. Unfortunately, a lot of the technology and infrastructure that's existing today has been used for pharmaceutical applications or high-value ingredients for food production. But obviously, with a macronutrient like protein, you need tons and tons and tons of product. And that's why we came to the UAE to find a good place to set up, the future fermentation facility, if you think of it that way. So think about a beer brewery, but rather than beer, it's actually brewing milk, in effect. So therefore, in terms of food security, in terms of localization of food production in areas that otherwise would find it very difficult to produce dairy, like here in the Middle East, I think this is where it really unlocks tremendous potential to produce identical, nourishing proteins, and in future will actually be cheaper than animal-derived versions. It's just a matter of time and optimization.
No, thank you very much. I mean, how exciting is that? You're revolutionizing the whole dairy sector. I think my next question actually was going to be about the challenges, but I think you've talked about that. So let me move to Jolene, and do save your questions. After Jolene, I'll give you a chance to ask some questions before we go to the next round. Okay, so Jolene, you're from Singapore, and Singapore is one of the most futuristic cities in the world. What is the tech with the most potential in urban areas?
Right. Maybe let me do a quick introduction of the work that I do as well. So I work for Nurasa. We focus on scaling up, and we focus on R&D. So Nurasa is a company that's a wholly owned subsidiary of the state-owned investment company Temasek. Over the last 10 years, Temasek has invested more than $8 billion from farm to fork around the world in new technologies. And beyond being a financial investor, in the last 2 years, I've helped to build up a new company that is driving acceleration and commercialization of the solutions that Bruce and all the panelists have spoken about, specifically in Southeast Asia. In Southeast Asia, we are focusing on a very different demographic. So every time I go to a business trip to visit David in San Francisco, or I go to Europe to look at the food markets there, you need to realize that Southeast Asia operates extremely differently, and Singapore is an exception of an exception. I'll explain why very shortly. Southeast Asia is an interesting place because it's going to be home to 250 million more people by the year 2030, and about 60 to 65% of the world's middle class will reside in Asia in 10 years. So there is a very, very different requirement for food. And when you're trying to scale solutions, it's not like a homogeneous market in the US or Europe. Asia is deeply fragmented when it comes to getting food to different places at accessible price points in distribution mechanisms that make sense. And new foods are always extremely interesting as an innovation. But the challenge that we've learned over the last few years is also that it's going to take a lot to scale to different places, and it's a true test of price parity. So when Alice asks me the question about, what is the most promising technology innovation, Asia is also home to more than 600 million smallholder farmers. That's not going away in the next 10 years. I started my career working with smallholder farmers, as well as people who are working in controlled environment agriculture in cities like Singapore. And the challenges are immensely difficult when it comes to cold chain logistics, when it comes to formulating a food product that would be interesting to different kinds of people across different parts of Asia. You can cross 30 minutes in Asia and you get a completely different cuisine. What are you going to do to drive adoption? So I don't think there's one technology that really becomes the most promising in that sense. It's really a new way of thinking about working with the big companies to access distribution channels that have been established to reach different people. One of the things that I think a lot about is we can always be investing in the most promising technology and the most promising innovation. But for Asia, a lot of that is going to boil down to how it reaches the farmers who have agricultural livelihoods, for people who will need to, at some point, do something different with their agricultural farmland or livelihood when climate change makes it impossible for them to grow food the way they used to, when they need to eat food in a completely different way, and prices of food become real, right? The real cost of food production will hit us very, very shortly. So I think on top of all the great work that the Good Food Institute and what David's doing in Food Tech Valley, driving all these research and innovation, there needs to be a huge focus on how do you drive commercialization and adoption on a level that goes beyond consumer awareness or consumer education.
Yeah, no, thank you very much. And of course, we also need to talk about nutritional security. And I would like to hear your thoughts on that before I bring in the audience. What is the nutritional security of these alternative proteins?
So I'll share a nice story from Singapore. In 2019, Singapore put out a goal. It's called 30 by 30. They wanted to produce 30% of its local nutritional needs by the year 2030. As of today, we still produce less than 10% of our food. We import more than 90% of it to Singapore. It's an exception of an exception because Singapore is one of the most affluent societies in Asia. In Southeast Asia, all of our neighbors don't function like us. We buy food from them, we import food from them, and in Singapore there is a very fantastic test market, right? So Bruce and David, they're familiar friends with me because they're also thinking about coming to Singapore. We're also the only country that has approved the sale of cultivated meat. We were the first, and the USDA, FDA had opened up that framework this year. Despite that, however, only a handful of people in Singapore have tasted these futuristic foods because there's not enough supply, it's too expensive, and people don't know what to do with it. So despite it being one of the most futuristic cities, nutritional security brings in the other dimension of beyond calories that you can produce for people. Even if you produce 30% of that in Singapore, the costs are going to be extremely high for now. Yeah. So who are we producing for? What happens to the other 70%? And also, what kind of nutritional needs are we addressing in the rest of Asia?
Thank you. Yeah. Well, thank you very much. And so we've had amazing 4 good examples of alternative protein innovation. But we have also heard about the challenges, the cost, the consumer acceptance, commercialization, and everything else. So I'm opening it up for questions from you guys before I come back to the panels. And I'll start with you. Or I have the... Should I start the lady here, then you behind her? Start with you, lady. All right.
Hi, good morning. Good morning, everyone. So my question would be, what are the challenges that we are facing today on the regulatory aspect, especially for precision fermentation, and especially in halal markets, right? So, and what is the future outlook for this?
Maybe I can...
Thank you very much. Should I take several or should I take one at a time? Let me take one more behind you. Yeah, the gentleman behind, yeah.
Thank you. Everybody mentioned scale and costs and that they need to be overcome. I'd love it if you could drill down specifically what do each of you think it will take to overcome those hurdles? Yeah. And what about using the Tesla model for product innovation? I mean, if milk is a commodity, maybe there's some kind of genetically altered, enhanced milk that could be a premium product that could make this a more sustainable industry to bridge the gap for cost.
Okay, thank you. Let's take those 2. The first one was on the regulatory hurdles. Do you want to who wants to take that? I think you wanted to jump in already. But do you want to take about the regulatory hurdles?
I'm happy to.
Okay.
I mean, so the regulatory.
Yeah.
I mean, we've been very pleased in the United States by how receptive FDA and USDA have been, and that has been bipartisan. So Donald Trump's FDA and USDA were very enthusiastic about bringing cultivated meat to regulatory approval. Similarly, precision fermentation products have not had a difficult time. Kudos to Singapore. They were still 2.5 years ahead of the United States. And what we are hearing indicates that at least for cultivated meat, we're going to see a lot more approvals. Europe is the big exception. From our perspective, Europe takes the precautionary principle far too seriously, especially if they care about things like climate change and species loss. But that is what it is. GFI's policy team are working very hard on it. We're working with the biotech industry. We're working with a lot of partners to try to clear those hurdles.
Thank you. UAE, maybe you can say something about the regulatory.
So basically, I love this question. Is basically
Can you
what we are
put your
doing
microphone,
right now.
microphone up? Yeah.
What we are doing right now, it's good that also Singapore already started, and actually started with accepting, lab-grown meat, and this is a good start for everyone in the world. What we are doing right now, we are aligning with different entities around Dubai when it comes to food safety, when it comes to Dubai Central Laboratory, as well as the Ministry of Climate Change and Environment. And what we are doing whenever there is a company that comes up with a new specialized type of food, we try to accelerate the acceptance or taking it as a pilot study. And through this network of different legislator, different government entities, stakeholders, we're trying to accelerate as much as we can whenever there's a company that comes up.
Okay.
We started with one company right now, but we are hoping also to, because every company will have a different type of business model, different type of product, but we are trying to set up the system for any future company that comes in and would like to go through the process.
Thank you. No, thanks. That's very good. The institutional collaboration that you've done. And so, did you want to say something about what Singapore? I know you said Singapore is already ahead and has done a lot there.
Yeah,
what was the secret?
I think with Singapore, they have paved the way for other people to engage in that conversation. But the same thing that's happening across the world is there's still a fragmentation of how regulation happens because there's no unified governance structure, right? So both on the regulatory framework for novel foods, what defines novel, what is history of safe use, what is generally recognized as safe. So that's one component of that. So Singapore is beginning to convene the head of food agencies and regulators every year to talk about how we can bring those regulatory sort of policymakers to talk to each other a little bit more. The other part of your question, actually, so I was part of the team building up a 4,000 square meter innovation center, and I had to go see the Fatwa committee in MUIS in Singapore to talk about halal certification. And the truth is, it's also not unified across different countries that issue halal certification on how people would think about this. Whether something in cultivated meat came from something of porcine origin, but something can only be halal in Singapore if the animal is killed. But with cultivated meat, you don't actually do that with the animal. So it's very difficult after you immortalize the cell lines, for example, to define whether it was.
So there are some glitches, right?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. David, I'm coming to you. And I also want you, when you think about that, also tackle the next question, because the next question was also about drilling down on the scale issue and the cost issue, and because you already have something piloting, can you tell us a little bit more?
Absolutely,
Thanks.
yeah. So I think, with regulatory, it really it's very case by case. It's dependent on the exact type of protein you're producing, the method by which you're producing it. And, so I think it's, at least with precision fermentation, it's already integrated into the food system. I would deem it as a lower risk process, assuming you're using GRAS-approved organisms and inputs to your process. And the interesting thing that many people don't know is that 90% of cheese made worldwide today already uses this technology in its production method via rennet, which is the key, or chymosin, which is the key enzyme that's used to curdle milk into curds and whey. So that's already adopted and has been adopted by the cheese industry since the early 1990s. All we're doing is taking that from a high-value enzyme and now actually extending it to a macronutrient. And that's what gives me a lot of hope in terms of the integration to food companies to integrate this technology. It's already consumed, it's already eaten, it's already proven safe. And all we're doing is extending it to something that could actually drive much bigger impact. So that's the exciting part. And the second part, in terms of the Tesla model, I think that's absolutely the approach, right? There's a cost curve, as with any new technology and its adoption, and you have to try and find ways to drive and get that into the hands of consumers as soon as possible to drive adoption, which in itself is a virtuous cycle, because the more you can sell, the lower the costs come down even more quickly. And of course, whilst we are a replacement for dairy, we shouldn't think of it in exactly that framework. It's actually better than dairy because it's lactose-free dairy, it's cholesterol-free. There's no antibiotics, there's no hormones. And when you think about dairy companies and their challenges with trying to now actually realise their 30% emissions reduction targets by 2030, at least in North America, that's what they're committing to, and to be net zero by 2050, yet 97% of their emissions is scope 3, which is emissions from their supply chain, and 80% of that is from milk alone. So how are you going to meet your emissions targets if you're continuing to use milk? So there's other value drivers and value in the price point of, for example, casein. There's embedded carbon that you're avoiding. There's embedded water, which you're avoiding. And water is becoming a scarcer and scarcer resource as we move forward, especially in places like California.
Okay.
So,
thank you so much. No, I can see there's a lot of other things to be considered. We still have some glitches. So I'm going to give the audience another chance to ask a few more questions before I come back to you. Yes, over there. Who else wants to ask? I'll take 2 questions.
Hi, thank you. I would have 2 questions if I may.
I'll only give you 1.
Okay, now I have to choose.
Okay.
Well, I guess one thing that I would be really interested in is when you eat, cow meat or if you drink milk or whatever it may be that comes from an animal, a lot of the quality depends on what that animal actually ate throughout its lifetime. How nutritious it is that it actually ate itself. So how does that translate to lab-made meat or to, lab-made dairy? How does the quality, Yeah.
Good question. I'll take one more here, and if we have time, I'll come back to you. There's one more here. So the first one, you keep that in mind, yeah?
Okay.
How does what the animal ate? Yeah.
Hi, I'm Roger Highfield from the Science Museum in London. We're working on a Future of Food exhibition. I'd love it if you could just tell me what technologies you think are going to be having a big impact in 10 years, but you're not allowed to talk about your own technology favorite,
Exactly.
okay?
Good idea. All right, so let's start with the one around what the animal ate. And Bruce, do you want to tackle that? You don't have a mic? Oh, the mic is gone. Share a mic.
Yeah, I mean, that question, I think, underlines one of the things that's particularly exciting about both plant-based meat and cultivated meat. Right now, if you're dealing with the sort of remit of a limited number of animals and a limited number of feeds, like the degree to which you can tweak and the path from tweaking the feed to changing the composition of the meat is pretty long. Whereas if you're turning plants into meat, or you're cultivating meat directly from cells, that path is significantly shorter. This also underlines, I think, one of the really big advantages of plant-based meat and cultivated meat, which Alice sort of nodded at the beginning, but right now, 70% of medically relevant antibiotics, antimicrobials, 70% are fed to farm animals. If we follow the UNFAO prediction of 50 to 100% more meat by 2050, in the last 27 years, meat production is up 80%. If it goes up 80% in the next 27 years, and we go from 70% of medically relevant antibiotics to something like 80% of the number of medically relevant antibiotics, the UK government says antimicrobial resistance is a bigger threat to humanity than climate change. Already kills 1.3 million people.
Yeah.
So the fact that we can eliminate antibiotics and the fact that we can directly change the meat in ways that are healthier and tastier and other advantages, rather than having to go through, the animal feed. It's another really big advantage.
Thank you.
Can I just add
breakthrough technologies? Yes.
Can I just add a comment around the dairy side of that as well?
Yeah.
Is that one of the biggest challenges in cheese making is actually the variation in milk supply. So cows is typically there's multiple dairies where milk is very inconsistent. And so that's why the actual process of traditional dairy manufacturing is actually to split milk down into its constituent components already, and then reassemble it to actually create stability in cheese production methods. And so that's really fascinating. So if you think about that, it's a reductive manufacturing approach. We can actually change those constituent components already with a direct replacement, which is completely stabilized. So the variation from the industry disappears. That allows for far more stability within the supply chains, cost stability, supply chain stability. Rather than spoiling milk in a few days, it will spoil in weeks, if not months.
Okay.
There's less. So there's a multitude of other benefits in terms of specifically dairy production that this technology can also solve for as well.
That's good. Ahmed, breakthrough technologies for the museum question, yeah?
Yeah, so what type of technology that the next 10 years?
Not necessarily your technology, but a breakthrough technology. And then I'll come to Jolene. Yeah.
I think It's basically technologies that we are speaking about today is actually can become a breakthrough technologies when they establish a very commercial viability through breakthroughs in R&Ds and breakthrough and actually bringing the cost down. When it comes to cellular agriculture, I think there's a huge potential. And what we saw in the past several years, the past 10 years actually, the drop is very significant. So I believe cellular agriculture have a lot of potential to become a breakthrough for our food. When it comes to insect based food, which can become a challenge, there is a big potential in it. The only issue is the consumer acceptance. So we might see that there will be a shift of how the food is actually presented. It all depends on the company and what is their business model and how they are actually presenting the product.
Yeah, I've heard good things about insect, and definitely insect food. So insect food and silent agriculture. Jolene, breakthrough technologies.
I think one aspect that would be really interesting is at the same time not just producing a new product or ingredient, but thinking about how you can augment the livelihoods of current agricultural farmers and workers. So with there's cellular agriculture, and then there's molecular farming, which is where you actually are able to program the seeds to produce target molecules or ingredients that you want to be expressed in conventional crops. There are several companies doing this already, where you can harvest protein, you can harvest colors, additives, and even anthocyanins and vitamins from things like lettuce and other common crops. So in order to actually then sort of produce higher value for what the farmers are already producing and doing what they do best, they're actually able to be given a second income stream from the ingredients that can be harvested from molecular farming.
Molecular farming, cellular agriculture, insect. So you have amazing technology there. And actually, I do still have a little bit of time before I ask the panelists for their final thoughts to get one question. So I'll allow you to ask your second question over there, and then I'll take Ms. Mahan. Yeah, good. Okay.
Well, thank you. That's great.
Yeah.
So my second question was about life cycle analysis and the real use of energy and water in these technologies, especially if we talk about upscaling and mass production of lab-made synthetic meat, for example. If the whole world was to eat that kind of meat, and it's really the numbers that we heard about and how much the meat consumption would increase, is it really going to be more sustainable if it's all made in labs and considering the energy amounts that are being used in those labs?
All right, thank you. Behind you one more. One last one.
Thank you, Alice. My question is, what does it take for us to think a little bit bigger instead of being very simplistic and pushing for one single technology, one single production system? What does it take to do all of it together?
Scale.
Knowing that the large population we're going to have and the huge challenges ahead of us. Thank you.
Good question. And maybe I'll add one, and then when you give you one round to do your last, you do these three together. Mine really is, like I said, I come from Africa. And some of this language, when I hear this whole technology, and it's kind of, it feels like, when I imagine a smallholder farmer, I'm imagining, how can we get this into a level where it's really understandable and it makes sense to them, because it's very technical and very scientific, yet it's very important for the reasons that I started with before, that we need to be thinking about this alternative, this innovation. So how do you make this simpler? And so we have a question about scale, which is very important. We have a question about life cycle analysis that you talked about. And then we have mine, in other words, how do we make this palatable? So Bruce, I'll start with you and then I'll come around with everybody. Use that as your final thoughts as we finish this panel. Thanks.
All right, I think I can sum up my answer in about 45 minutes. I hope that's okay.
You have 1 minute each, 1 minute each.
So on the life cycle analysis question, cultivated chicken requires about 1/4 the land. Plant-based chicken requires about 1/6 the land. Plant-based and cultivated beef both require about 1/20 of the land. And contribute 1/10 of the direct emissions, literally eliminates methane. So as much methane is attributable to ruminant digestion as oil and gas combined. McKinsey modeling has said that at 50% penetration for alternative proteins, you'd get 5 gigatons of decreased emissions. That's more than twice decarbonizing the entire, passenger transport industry, with similar numbers on water. So it's a huge positive advantage. It is not a silver bullet. It is not, all of the problems of agriculture. But it is the case that the IPCC has said unless meat consumption goes down, Paris climate goals will be impossible. And across all of the systems solutions for industrial animal agriculture, 11 of 11 peer-reviewed journals say we'll have at least 60% more meat in 2050 and even more ruminants. So this has to be a part of the solution, because all of the people in this room, even if this were a food systems conference, my challenge would be what that anybody is working on is trying to decrease meat consumption. And there really are just two things: convince consumers to eat less meat, which is what we've been trying to do for 50 years. It hasn't worked. Meat is up 80% in just the last 27 years, and alternative proteins. So we do need to go all in on these technologies, or Paris goals are going to be impossible.
Thank you. And of course, we're not going to stop eating meat. For us in Africa, we still have protein deficiency. You need to tackle that. Ahmed, scale.
When it comes in terms of accepting different type of technologies, the question that was being asked, what we do in Footic Valley, we don't focus only on cellular agriculture. We focus and we try to scan many different type of technologies. So we are trying to focus on control environment agriculture and the growth that happened within this field. And we see the challenges, so we observe and what we can do to actually make it more commercially viable in the next several years. When it comes to also looking into desert farming is another way. You have also a RAS system, which is aquaculture, which is also can become a very commercially viable solution. So we are looking at different type of technologies and solution to cover the nutrition that's a human would need. When it comes to actually scaling these type of technologies, of course, with the bigger economy, there's economy of scale, which you can reduce the cost of consumption. But I would like to come back to the Tesla model. Okay, sometimes you need to focus in the niche, just to allow the business to stand, and once it's actually reach a viable position, then it can grow. And this is what we are trying to do. Is we are advising also any company that comes is that not to do a generic type. If they are, for example, producing lettuce, try to produce something special. Try to start with a niche segment, just for the sake of having surviving the initial startup phase. And once you scale up, then you can actually grow further. And eventually, once we actually manage to scale up these type of technology, then we can offer it to a bigger segment within the population.
Thank you, Ahmed. David, 1 minute.
I'm going to end in a message of hope and positivity, and why I pivoted my career of aerospace engineering for over 14 years to solve and work in the challenges within the food space. And if you think about, at least from a climate perspective, dairy alone contributes more than the entire aviation sector combined today, let alone in 20 years when we potentially have to double that output. And the ethics in the food system combined with the health issues really allowed me to open up my eyes and realize that technology needs to help solve this problem. And people always ask me, which technology do you think is going to win? And I always say that, well, that's ridiculous, because we're creating a whole new system. So think about creating the current transport system. You're going to say a train? Which transport method is going to win? Is it a train? Is it a plane? Is it a boat? They all serve different purposes for different applications. And I think we need a plethora of different opportunities across plant-based, cellular, precision fermentation, molecular farming, to produce an abundance of different molecules. And the first domestication was of macroorganisms. The second domestication is of microorganisms. It's infinitely more powerful. You can literally create things out of the invisible and thereby reap all of the benefits for the impact that it serves. So I think, it's a really exciting era. It's the renaissance of food, and it allows us to produce far more products, far more efficiently, which is, I think, the hope for the future.
We can feel the hope and the excitement. Jolene, you're the last word. Give us some hope. Thank you.
I'll throw some color to what Bruce and David have already said. Don't hate me for this. One is, coming from Asia, people don't grow up eating meat. We're mostly vegetarian. We're completely fine with plant-based foods, not in the form that they're being presented to us right now. I don't need a plant-based burger all the time, and we've been plant-based out of necessity. For people who are growing more affluent, eating meat is a sign of that, and it's not going to go away. Not just for protein deficiency, but it's also just, as you grow more affluent, you want to eat what you couldn't afford, right, in the past. So that's one. So that's something to think about. The second one is responding to the question about why doesn't food take on the Tesla model, where you first have a premium? Because a Tesla is a Tesla, and food is food. You don't pay a premium for food on the days that you're worrying about other things. And unfortunately, with food, if you're a consumer, most of us are in this room, if you taste something bad once, you don't come back for it. You don't give it a second chance to iterate. And I think that's the challenge, and that's why it's so punishing to work in food, because you can put out innovation as quickly as you can, but once consumers form a certain idea about what that product is, you can't go back. It's not like a Tesla. It's not like you go back to the next iPhone even though your previous one was glitching. Food doesn't work like that. You go back to what you know. So that's, I think, something I'll leave you with.
Thank you so much. Wow, I couldn't have thought of a message more powerful than that. A Tesla is a Tesla. Food is food. Food is important. So we talked about cost. We talked about fragmentation in regulation. We talked about consumer, all of them being challenges. But one thing is important. We do need alternative proteins because the current food system is killing us with antibiotics. We have greenhouse gas emissions. We have all the bad nature loss as well. So we do need to continue talking about this possibility of alternative proteins and how to get them more. Thank you very much for being here and for listening to a wonderful panel. Thank you, panel.